It was August 26, 1346. Out in a field of crops in France, about 9,000 of U.S. Englishmen stood ready to face nearly 30,000 of Europe's best knights. The French had every advantage: more men, stronger horses, and the backing of Europe's most powerful rulers. They were so sure of victory, they thought killing our king was their right. But 4 hours later it was over. 1,500 French nobles, princes, dukes, even kings lay dead. Our losses? Just 40 men. Not 440. And with that, 5 centuries of proud chivalry collapsed in chaos. It wasn't noble knights who won that day, but farmers with swords and spears. They struck down the king of Bohemia himself. The French knights tried to flee, but most were hunted down and killed. In a desperate rage, the French commanders turned on their own Genoese crossbowmen, slaughtering them where they stood. For weeks, the crows were so full from the feast of corpses they could barely fly. That field became known as the Sea of Slaughter. Many died buried in the mud. The old code of knighthood, the idea of Kulina, was shattered by common men with simple weapons. And so began the 100 Years' War, with France suffering one of its most humiliating defeats. By the end of the story, you'll see how a 10-shilling weapon destroyed a 1,000-pound army, why the French killed their own, and how a king's death turned into one of history's darkest moments. Let's go back to where it began. King Edward III of England had marched into Normandy with about 15,000 men, burning his way through northern France. The locals called it Chevauchée, the scorched path of war. The French king, desperate to prove his strength, disguised himself and began a campaign of destruction. As we raided villages and tried to retreat toward our own territory, his army finally caught us. King Philip VI of France had gathered the largest army Europe had ever seen, around 30 to 35,000 men. 12,000 were heavy cavalry, knights in full plate armor on massive war horses. These weren't just fighters, they were Europe's ruling class. Princes, dukes, and kings from across the continent joined in. The Holy Roman Emperor sent troops. The King of Bohemia brought his household. Even the Moravian knights came. It was like a medieval Avengers lineup, all hungry for English blood. French knights were the tanks of their time, walking fortresses trained from childhood for war. Their armor cost more than a village earned in a year. For 5 centuries, heavy cavalry had ruled Europe's battlefields. They fought to crush and be crushed, men bred for war. Edward III knew we were outnumbered, exhausted, and short on supplies. But we had one thing the French didn't value: longbows. 5,000 Welsh and English archers, many of them farmers or criminals, had trained since childhood. Every Sunday after church, Englishmen practiced archery by law. Training with any other weapon was illegal. A longbow didn't look like much, just a 6-foot stick of wood. It wasn't fancy or beautiful, but in trained hands it was deadly. A skilled archer could shoot 12 arrows a minute, hitting targets over 250 yards away, about 2.5 football fields. Every 5 seconds, another arrow would fly with pinpoint accuracy. The bow was heavy too. Pulling it took 150 to 180 pounds of force. Historians can still identify longbowmen from their skeletons. Their bones warped from years of uneven strain, with the left arm often longer than the right. King Edward positioned us on a nearby hill, forcing the French to attack uphill. He split the army into 3 divisions and built a defensive wall between them, overlapping the firing zones of our archers. Then he did something no one expected. He ordered his knights to fight on foot. For the first time, English nobles fought like common soldiers. It was unheard of. But Edward understood something the French didn't. The age of horsebound knights was ending. His decision caused outrage among his own men. These knights had spent their lives training to fight from horseback. Their war horses were worth more than gold. To them, fighting on foot was shameful, beneath their honor. But Edward reminded them that survival mattered more than pride, and they obeyed. That night, as our camp settled on the Manukia Plateau, the scene was eerily calm. Knights polished their armor and rubbed honeycomb wax onto their clothes for protection. Wooden stakes were driven into the ground, and torches lit the night as preparations finished. Scouts reported that the fields ahead were littered with flesh and broken bones from earlier skirmishes. Meanwhile, the French army was on the move. When they reached the village of Vicen, we were already asleep, resting for what was to come. Each French knight was proud and arrogant, convinced of his own glory. We dug deep pits and planted sharpened stakes in front of our lines, traps meant to cripple their horses. The field became a death trap waiting to spring. Disorder spread among the French ranks. Knights in white cloaks stumbled past each other in confusion. Some argued about whether to capture Edward alive or kill him outright. The scene looked more like a chaotic tournament than a real battle. By dawn on August 26th, the French army had no choice but to march toward us. The sky was dark with smoke. Villages still burned behind them. As thousands of knights rode through their ruined lands, farmers cursed them from the fields. To the French, it was an unbearable insult, one that demanded revenge. By the time they reached Crécy, King Philip's men were exhausted. He ordered them to rest and prepare to attack the next day. But impatience and pride got the better of them. The French kings showed no restraint. When they saw us waiting calmly on that hill, fury took over. They wanted Edward III captured alive. In the afternoon, dark clouds began to roll in. We were ready, but the storm that was coming would tell a very different story. We stayed quiet that morning, taking down our small forts and letting the French come to us. The Genoese crossbowmen, fighting for the French, refused to back down. But as they advanced, their formation stretched thin and became useless. Then came a brief rainstorm, small, but enough to decide the fate of thousands. When King Philip reached the field, he saw us positioned on the hill and ordered his men to wait until morning. But his knights wouldn't listen. Ignoring commands, they surged forward in a frenzy. The king's control vanished. The French army stopped being an army. It became a mob of proud nobles who refused to take orders. Even before the battle truly began, Philip had already lost his men. The first to die were the Genoese crossbowmen. They were some of the best and most expensive mercenaries in Europe. But their heavy crossbows were slow to reload, and when the brief rain hit, their bowstrings became soaked. Their range dropped and they were helpless. Still, they marched through the mud toward us. Unaware they were walking straight into death. The moment they came within range, our longbows sang. Arrows cut through the air like a storm of iron. They pierced visors, slipped through ear holes, and tore through armor joints and thighs. Even the arrows that didn't penetrate still smashed into steel like hammers on drums. Each volley was like rolling dice with death. Wave after wave of French soldiers followed, trampling their own dead. The ground turned slick with blood and rain. Spears and arrows fell so thick it looked like snow. Then the traps began to work. Horses stumbled into hidden pits and crashed onto sharpened stakes. The battlefield became a swamp of blood and mud. The armored knights, weighed down with 60 pounds of steel, couldn't even stand. Some drowned where they fell. We ran out of arrows more than once, but that didn't stop us. Our men dashed forward, pulled arrows from the corpses of fallen French knights, and fired them right back. The French were being killed by their own weapons. And then came the most tragic figure of all, the blind King John of Bohemia. Blind for nearly a decade, he had still come to fight. When he heard his side was losing, he refused to retreat. "The King of Bohemia does not flee from battle," he said. He ordered his men to tie their horses' reins to his, so they could lead him into the fight. Before he died, he wanted one last charge, one final strike. He was about 50 years old when he rode straight into the storm of arrows. The English surrounded him. He and all his companions were cut down in moments. When his body was found, he was still tied to his fallen knights, his eyes open, a broken spear clutched in his hand. He had gotten his wish, to die fighting his enemy. Edward III's son, the Black Prince, was proud of his courage that day. After the battle, he took King John of Bohemia's broken spear, the symbol of the fallen Dark King. That spear would remain his emblem for life. As the sun went down, the French launched 16 separate attacks. 16 times, they charged straight into what had become a slaughterhouse. Each assault was weaker than the last, but still they came, desperate for glory, dying in the mud beside their comrades. Even King Philip fought in person during the final charge. His horse was killed beneath him, and a spear tore through his beard. When he tried to return to the fight, his guards had to drag him away by force. The sacred oriflamme, the royal banner of France, was left trampled in the mud. When night fell, we could hardly believe we'd won. The fighting went on until dawn, the field echoing with the cries of dying men. We killed every French knight we found, even when our arrows and spears ran out. Farmers used knives, sticks, and wooden stakes to finish off the wounded. By morning, on August 27th, the scale of the slaughter became clear. The battlefield was thick with bodies: the Count of Flanders, the Count of Blois, the Duke of Lorraine, the Count of Alençon, the Count of Sancerre, all dead. Over 1,500 nobles perished, including 11 princes and thousands of knights. Most who fled were hunted down and killed, some even slain by their own servants. Our losses? About 40 men, only 2 of them knights. One English knight had stood against roughly 750 French nobles. The numbers seemed unbelievable. Chroniclers at the time thought it must have been divine intervention, but the truth was simpler and far more brutal. Longbows, discipline, and clever tactics had crushed the proudest army in Europe. For centuries, knights had believed their noble blood made them unbeatable, blessed by God, superior to common men. But at Crécy, Welsh and English farmers proved otherwise. Skill and strategy had beaten blood and birthright. The world's view of war changed forever. The aftermath was grim. So many noblemen were dead that France's ruling class was gutted. Their bodies lay rotting for days. Crows and dogs feasted on royal flesh. Peasants scavenged armor and gold from the fallen, growing rich overnight from the spoils of war. The English army marched on toward Calais, through fields piled high with corpses. Locals later called it the Golden Field because of the wealth stripped from the dead. For years after, the soil there turned up bones. France's losses went far beyond the battlefield. In a single day, their aristocracy had been shattered, and the very foundation of medieval warfare, the power of the noble class, was destroyed. After the massacre at Crécy, the French had to rebuild their entire army. They started recruiting more crossbowmen, forming new village militias, and trying to imitate the English way of fighting on foot, the same dishonorable tactic they had once mocked. But war itself was changing. Those early longbow battles turned into years-long campaigns. The age of the mounted knight was over. From then on, wars weren't decided by courage or noble blood, but by planning, discipline, and firepower. Battle had become a calculation, a deadly game of range and timing. The romantic idea of chivalric warfare died that day in the mud. Yet France didn't learn the lesson right away. 10 years later, they repeated the same mistakes. Another hill, another charge, another slaughter. They lost yet another king and thousands more nobles before they finally accepted what Crécy had proved. It took nearly a century for France to truly adapt. The questions left behind were devastating. If common Welsh archers could wipe out France's finest knights, what did that say about divine favor or noble birth? If peasants could kill princes, what did that mean for the entire feudal system? Crécy didn't just destroy an army, it shattered the very idea of nobility. The blood of chivalry lost its power. From then on, English longbowmen became the most feared soldiers in Europe. But their reign was short-lived. It took years of training to master the longbow. You couldn't turn peasants into archers overnight. And when new weapons arrived, simple ones any man could use in a day, the age of the longbow ended. The weapon that had slain knights was soon replaced by gunpowder and shot. Still, the legend lived on, especially that of the blind king of Bohemia. His last charge wasn't seen as madness anymore, but as a final act of honor. He knew he would die, yet he rode forward anyway, striking one last blow for glory. Crécy's story became the symbol of a turning point, when respect gave way to survival, and skill began to matter more than birth. Modern historians now see it as the birth of organized warfare, where tactics, preparation, and ranged power triumphed over tradition and pride. In 1346, on that muddy French hillside, every principle of modern combat revealed itself. The proud French knights, once the pride of Europe, ended up killing their own allies in confusion. While the English calmly picked their targets like men at a shooting range, the French commanders ordered massacres against their own Genoese crossbowmen. Count d'Alençon, who led that slaughter, was dead within minutes. More Frenchmen died by friendly fire than by English hands. Crows and dogs feasted on the remains of kings. Even peasants, hardened by war, were horrified by the sight. Today, a small memorial field called Crécy-en-Ponthieu marks the spot. Tour buses pass by, but few truly know what happened there. Yet on August 26, 1346, the medieval world ended in that barren stretch of farmland. 500 years of military tradition, the rule of knights, the honor of chivalry, the glory of personal combat, all died in one afternoon. Ordinary men with bows and arrows ended it. England didn't just win a battle that day. It ended an era. Because no matter how brave the knight, courage alone could never defeat precision, and pride could never stop an arrow.